Hello everyone. Welcome to this video lecture on the poem Refugee Mother and Child, written by celebrated Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe. So in this video we will begin with a brief introduction about the poet Achebe, and we'll move on to the context in which this particular poem was written, and then at the final part, we will look at a line by line analysis of the poem Refugee Mother and Child. Let's begin with a brief introduction to the poet Chinua Achebe. He died recently, that's in 2013, but he was someone who was much celebrated in literary circles and particularly well known for his novels rather than his poem, although you have a poem to study now. So he is regarded primarily as a novelist, then a poet and a critic. And his first and most popular novel is titled Things Fall Apart. Although this was his very first novel, he became instantly popular for the characters that he wove into this narrative, for the traditions that he introduced to his readers through this particular novel. This was a time when European writers used to picturize Africa and other parts of the world which were non-Western or non-European as primitive or uncivilized or worthless, insignificant. They often portrayed, for example, the Africans as an anonymous mass of people which speak gibberish, who do not have a culture of their own in comparison to the European traditions. So it is into this particular arena that Chinua Achebe comes. And along with other writers like him, he introduces to the world the nuances of African lifestyle and their culture, which is very rich. And they present before the readers tribal life, particularly that of the Igbo tribe. That is what you find in the novel Things Fall Apart through the eyes of a well known character, Okongo. He is someone who introduced African culture and tradition to his readers, as we just discussed. He highlights the clash between Western and African values. He presents very clearly in his works that African life and culture and the traditions are not primitive or uncivilized. These are mere labels that the Europeans attribute to the Eastern or non Western cultures. But he presents the fact that there is a clear conflict between these two cultures, and how one, particularly that of the Europeans, when they colonize a land like Africa, they force these Africans to follow the European tradition and to ignore their past, which is rich in their traditions and their cultural values. So he presents this vividly in his novels and also in his poetry. His other major novels include No Longer at Ease, Arrow of God, and The Anthills of Savannah. Now, we look at the context in which this particular poem was written. Remember, Achebe is a Nigerian writer, and he himself belonged to the Igbo tribe, which I mentioned before. And there was a time in the history of Nigeria when a particular state titled Biafra wanted to be independent from Nigeria. So this happened during the second half of the 1960s, when the Biafrans wanted to be free and they started a revolution protesting against the Nigerian government. So this led to a lot of conflict between the Biafrans and the government. And this clash or this conflict lasted for almost like 2.5 years. And during this process, what happened was almost 2 million people died. Many were orphaned and widowed. And during this process, the civilians, the ordinary people of Biafra, were forced to leave from their homeland, and they were supposed to stay at these refugee camps. So that's where you need to know about what or who is a refugee. What is a refugee camp? Whom do you consider as a refugee? So refugee crisis happens when a particular group of people are forced to leave their homeland or their own homes and move to a foreign land and get settled there. Right? That's not their homeland, but this is because they don't have any other options. So this the reasons could be war, famine, or civil war, as in this case. So they are forced, they are not moving with their will, or they are forced to move from their homeland and they stay in these camps. And these camps are like temporary settlements. They may not have all the required facilities that they used to have at their home. So here Chinua Achebe is someone, although he was a writer, a poet, he was not content within his ivory tower like other writers who were uh, not concerned about the social issues of their time. But Achebe was also an activist. He spoke for the rights of the Biafrans and he supported their cause for independence. So maybe we can assume that Achebe once visited one of these refugee camps, and the poem is a result of that particular incident, that he might have observed the refugees who were there in that camp, and he might have observed a particular mother and child, and once he came back he was moved to write this poem and present to us the condition of a refugee life. So you see that is the context of this particular poem, and you can read more about the Biafran refugee crisis in the notes given. Let's begin with the poem Refugee Mother and Child. No Madonna and child could touch that picture of a mother's tenderness, for a son she soon would have to forget. This is how he begins his poem. No Madonna and child could touch that picture of a mother's tenderness. He happens to see a mother and a child in the refugee camp. A refugee camp would be full of people. There'll be several mothers, there'll be several children roaming around. But Achebe focuses on one particular mother and her child. There's something about them that catches his attention. And what is that something? That is the tenderness, that affection that the mother holds for her child. And it attracts him, and he is trying to describe this motherly affection and tenderness that he watches there in the camp. And the more he thought about it, he was reminded of the Madonna and Child. Madonna and Child is a reference to Renaissance paintings on Mother Mary and infant Jesus. You must have seen several such paintings where they tried to capture that divine affection that Mother Mary had for Jesus Christ, which is encapsulated in these pictures. But when he looks at this refugee mother and child, he feels that the tenderness that he sees there cannot be compared to any paintings that he has ever seen, that of the mother and the child by these Renaissance artists. It was far more greater than that. It was something more tender. There was something more affectionate that he can't put in words. He's trying to use a comparison there, but he fails. For a son, she soon would have to forget. That line is important because it shows us that the mother is aware of the fact that her child or her son is about to die. These might be his last moments. And the mother knows that. Why? Why is that so? Because it's a refugee camp. You can assume the fact that there are no facilities out there, there are no food or any proper nutrition that is available for the children. So the child is dying out of malnutrition or malnourishment. So she knows that her child is about to die and she's about to forget her son soon, and still she's showering her tenderness and her affection towards this little child of hers. And then gradually in the next stanza, Achebe presents to us a brief idea about how the camp looks like. Why is the child dying? What's the situation there like? That is what's described in the second stanza. The air was heavy with odors of diarrhea of unwashed children, with washed out ribs and dried up bottoms, struggling in labored steps behind blown empty bellies. The air was heavy with odors. How can air be heavy? So maybe he's referring to the smell there, the bad smell uh, that surrounds the refugee camp, or it causes some sense of heaviness for the onlooker, right? So it's full of smell of diarrhea of these unwashed children. There's no proper hygiene there in the camp. There is no proper treatment made available for these refugees. These kids are roaming around unwashed in unhealthy circumstances, which creates a heavy odor there in that refugee camp. Washed out ribs and dried up bottoms. That's again a description of these little children who are roaming around. Probably this child that we were talking about, the mother's son who's about to die, would also might look like that. You remember this picture that we saw in the beginning of these kids with these bodies with their washed out ribs. You can see that their ribs can be counted with their blown up bellies. Refers That's a condition where when you face malnourishment, that's how the body looks like. The bellies are full of air that it's blown up. There's no food available, and their ribs are washed out. Means you can clearly count these ribs. What dried up bottom, struggling in labored steps. What do you mean by labored steps? Steps that are taken with so much labor, so much effort. They can't walk properly. Maybe their legs look like sticks, right? They can't make those firm steps that a healthy child would make. They are walking with much difficulty. So that is the meaning of those lines, which describes to us the condition of these refugee camps. Most mothers there had long ceased to care, but not this one. Most mothers there had long ceased to care. Ceased to care. They have stopped caring for their children. Most of them. Why? Because there's nothing that they can do about it. This is a refugee camp, and for quite some time they have been in that situation. They have seen the facts. They know for a reason that nothing's gonna change. The authorities are not giving what they require. So they have lost hope in a sense, and therefore they have ceased to care. It's not to be read as an accusation. Chibi is not accusing these other mothers who do not care for their children. It is more of a representation of what life is like for these poor women without any facilities, with no one to take care of their children. They have lost hope. When you are full of pain and when you have to go through intense suffering, then you lose that hope. And what makes this particular mother and child different from them? That is what he moves on to in the next few lines. Not this one. She held a ghost smile between her teeth, and in her eyes the ghost of a mother's pride as she combed the rust-colored hair left on his skull. And then, singing in her eyes, began carefully to part it. This is more like a picture that he took, and he's describing that picture to us. We, the readers, can actually see that, envision that, visualize this particular scene from the camp. What is his mother doing? There's a faint smile on her face, and she is looking at her child with tender affection. And what is she doing? She's combing the rust colored hair left on his skull. And she seems to sing a song. She's not singing, but there's some sort of a song in her eyes. And she's carefully parting the hair of her child, just the way any mother would do, combing the child's hair. But how is she different? The ghost smile, the ghost of a mother's pride. There are certain words that Achebe carefully places in these poems, like ghost and the skull. All these are symbolic of the imminent death of this child. The child is about to die quite soon. These words remind us of that fact as we read through these lines, right? So the ghost smile of the mother, the ghost um, pride, ghost of a mother's pride, what does it refer to? Maybe these are like faint smile that she had on her face, or that sense of pride that every mother would have for her son when she looks at him or her, right? But here it could also be a reference to the memories that she had of a past life when she was truly happy. It's just a memory now. The life full of joy and pride, that a mother often has for her child. Whatever the child does, a mother would always be proud of him or her. The same way, this mother might also have had a past before this crisis happened. And right now, it's all a thing of the past. It's just a faint memory in her mind. It's not real. It's an abstract thought. It's a mere concept. So maybe that's the reason why her smile is referred to as a ghost smile, and her pride is also considered as a faint memory of a happy past. And she's combing the rust colored hair left on his skull. The rust colored hair which is left on his, most of his hair has fallen off, and there's just a few hair on his head. It's not mentioned as head, but rather skull, again a reference to the death that is about to happen. And the rust colored hair also refers to the malnourishment that the child suffers from. And she is parting the hair of this child. In another life, this would have been a little daily act of no consequence before his breakfast in school. Now she did it like putting flowers on a tiny grave. In another life, this would have been a little daily act of no consequence. What is this another life? If this was not the situation that the mother and the child was in, if they were not in the refugee camp, maybe a happy past that they had, if it was another life, another circumstance, another setting, or maybe another household of the rich and the privileged, they never have to suffer like this. It's always the poor and the underprivileged who suffers in these camps most often. Right? So that is maybe Achebe is hinting at that through these words, in another life. This would have been a daily act of no consequence. Nobody cares about the scene where a mother is parting the child's hair. It's just a routine. It's just a daily act which every mother does for his or for her child before the child's school or the breakfast. It's just a simple act which nobody bothers about. But here, Achebe bothers. He is concerned about this very act that he sees in the refugee camp, because he instantly relates it to a possible future scene where the mother would be putting flowers on his tiny grave. When the child would die, the mother would be placing these flowers on his grave. So as she is combing the hair of the child, maybe she is remembering, or she is reminding herself of the fact that these must be her last moments with her beloved son, and that she would soon be putting flowers on his tiny grave. It's more of a simile there, for he uses the word like and comparing this act to the act of putting flowers on a grave. So he's using this figure of speech to talk about the imminent death that is very much evident in these lines of the poem. So Achebe captures a lot of themes through these particular lines, and the first and the most prominent theme is the celebration of motherhood. So you find that this mother, he is focusing not on a particular child, he's not focusing on a family, but particularly on a child and her son, and the motherly affection that she has for her son. And the literatures have always hailed motherhood in most of these writings, where a mother's love is considered as the purest form of love. A mother is someone who would love her child without any conditions. A child need not prove herself or himself to deserve a mother's love. A child needn't do anything at all. The mother would still love her child. The same way that purity, that truth, the depth of a mother's love is captured in these poems, particularly through that particular mother and child that he sees at the refugee camp. There is, and also it's a love that is, as we already talked about, it's not only about an unconditional love, it's also about a love that do not change with circumstances. Right now, they are not in a pleasant setting. They do not have anything that they require for a peaceful life, but still in that setting, in that situation, the mother's love is still true. It's still deep enough. You find a tinge of hope and optimism in this poem, although it's predominantly pathos that you find in this poem. It's more of a tone of death and sorrow, but still in the ghost smile of the mother, in that ghost sense of the mother's pride, in that, in those words, in another life, you can see that the mother slightly hopes for a better tomorrow. Just like any other mother, she also hopes that someone would come and help them out of the situation. So there is a slight tinge of hope and optimism also evident in some of these lines in the poem. And this is clearly a mark of distinction that is made between the rich and the poor, the privileged and the unprivileged. In another life is a clear example for that. In another life of the rich, of the privileged, this would never have been the situation. But for the weak and the underprivileged, for the poor, once they become refugees, there's no one to talk for them. There's no one to help them out of that miry clay that they are in. Right? So that is clearly laid out in the lines of this poem. And in a way, you can consider this as actually his call for action for the readers. He's trying to help the readers understand the situation of these refugees and do something about it in the life of these biafrans. Because this particular poem was published soon after the crisis, this refugee crisis that happened in the 1970s, towards the end of 1960s, early 1970s. So maybe he's calling his readers, it's a call for action as well. And finally, we'll also look at the comparison to Christ and Mother Mary. Right in the beginning of the poem, he is trying to make a comparison between this refugee mother and child to that of Mother Mary and infant Jesus. Although he says that these two pictures, in a way, can't be compared in terms of the tenderness. But what actually, when he tries to compare one to the other, he's elevating the status of the refugee mother and child to a divine level. Right? He is placing this refugee mother and child at the same level as that of Mother Mary and infant Jesus. The world reveres the Madonna and the child. The world looks with awe at these paintings. But who cares about these refugee mothers and children in these camps? So maybe he's letting the world know that this is the Madonna and the child that's right there in front of you. Respect them, take care of them, those who are suffering. It's also a symbol of ultimate sacrifice and suffering. Just the same way Mother Mary and infant Jesus suffered, you remember. If you know the biblical story, when Jesus was born, when he was brought to the temple for circumcision, Mother Mary was informed that this child would die an early death. Mother Mary knew right at the beginning that Jesus would be crucified and that he would be the savior for the whole world. There's a reason, there's a purpose behind that sacrifice. But still, as a mother who bore this child in her womb for 9 long months, living with that awareness, living with that knowledge might have been too much for her to bear. That pain must have been too intense every single day, every single moment. She knew within her that this is a life of sacrifice. She has to let go of this child when he will be crucified. And the prophecy was fulfilled as well. If you place refugee mother and child in the same level and try to compare it, she's also going through a similar crisis. She's also aware of the fact that the son whom she bore is about to die, may not have many more days to live. And when she combs his hair, she does it like putting flowers on his tiny grave. She's also suffering every single moment. So he actually kind of opens our eyes to look around us and see the Madonna and child in these refugees in various parts of the world. I hope it's clear for you. Thank you. Happy learning.